NFL dynasties don't just happen. They're built through years of perfect decisions, elite talent, and a little bit of luck. But here's the thing about being on top. There's only one way to go, and that's down. Today, we're breaking down the most spectacular dynasty collapses in NFL history. And trust me, some of these falls were harder than others. But first, let's define what we're talking about. A dynasty isn't just a good team that wins a lot. A dynasty is sustained excellence over multiple years with multiple championships. We're talking about teams that dominated entire eras, struck fear into opponents, and seemed unstoppable. The Packers of the 1960s, the Steelers of the 70s, the 49ers and Cowboys of the 80s and 90s, and the Patriots of the 2000s. And a collapse? That's when all that dominance comes crashing down. Sometimes it's gradual, sometimes it's instant, but it's always brutal. Whether it's a key retirement, a devastating injury, front office stupidity, or the salary cap finally catching up, every dynasty eventually meets its end. Some collapses are predictable. Father Time is undefeated. Others come out of nowhere and leave fans wondering what the hell just happened. Today, we're covering them all, from the expected to the shocking, and showing you exactly how empires fall in the NFL. Let's start with the original NFL dynasty, Vince Lombardi's Green Bay Packers. From 1961 to 1967, they won 5 NFL championships, including the first 2 Super Bowls. They were the gold standard, the team everyone measured themselves against. Lombardi was more than a coach. He was a football god. His players would run through walls for him. The Packers weren't just winning, they were dominating. They had Bart Starr, Paul Hornung, Jim Taylor, and a defense that could shut down anybody. Then came February 1968. Lombardi stepped down as head coach. He said he was burned out, needed a break from the pressure. The Packers promoted Phil Bankston, Lombardi's defensive coordinator, thinking the system would continue. It didn't. The collapse was immediate and brutal. In 1968, their first season without Lombardi, the Packers went 6-7-1. They missed the playoffs for the first time in 7 years. Suddenly, the aura was gone. Players who had been unstoppable under Lombardi looked ordinary. The mystique that made them champions evaporated overnight. But here's the kicker. Lombardi didn't even leave Green Bay. He stayed as general manager, watching his former team struggle while he sat in the front office. The players knew he was there, knew he wasn't coaching them anymore, and it messed with their heads. The Packers wouldn't win another championship for 29 years. 29 years! One man's retirement ended a dynasty and started nearly 3 decades of mediocrity. The lesson? Sometimes the coach isn't just the coach. He's the entire identity of the franchise. When Lombardi left, the Packers didn't just lose a coach. They lost their soul. The Pittsburgh Steelers of the 1970s were a machine. 4 Super Bowls in 6 years. The Steel Curtain defense. Terry Bradshaw, Franco Harris, Lynn Swann, John Stallworth. They weren't just winning, they were demolishing teams. The Steel Curtain was the most feared defense in football. Joe Green, Jack Lambert, Jack Ham, Mel Blount. These guys didn't just stop offenses, they destroyed them. Quarterbacks had nightmares about playing in Pittsburgh. But by the early 1980s, cracks were showing. The core of that defense was aging. Joe Green was slowing down. Jack Lambert's back was shot. The guys who had terrorized the league for a decade were suddenly mortal. Then came the real problem. Terry Bradshaw. The quarterback who had led them to 4 Super Bowls was falling apart. Elbow injuries, concussions, the hits were adding up. In 1982, he threw more interceptions than touchdowns. The golden arm was tarnishing. The collapse accelerated in 1983. Bradshaw retired mid-season due to elbow problems. Franco Harris, the heart of their running game, was released after a contract dispute. Suddenly, the Steelers went from champions to also-rins. They missed the playoffs in 1980, 1981, 1982, 1983, 1984, and 1985. 6 straight years. The team that had owned the 70s couldn't even make the postseason in the 80s. The Steelers' collapse teaches us something important. Even the most dominating teams can't escape Father Time. When your core players age out simultaneously, there's no gradual decline. It's a cliff, and you fall off fast. The San Francisco 49ers had the longest dynasty in modern NFL history. From 1981 to 1998, They won 5 Super Bowls and made the playoffs 16 times. Joe Montana, Steve Young, Jerry Rice, the West Coast offense, they redefined how football was played. But their collapse was death by 1,000 cuts, and it started with something that wasn't even their fault: the salary cap. In 1994, the NFL introduced the salary cap to create parity. The 49ers had been outspending everyone, stockpiling talent like they were collecting baseball cards. Suddenly, they couldn't just buy their way to championships anymore. The first casualty was their depth. They had to let good players walk because they couldn't afford to keep everyone. The roster that had been 50 players deep was suddenly thin at key positions. Then came the retirements. Joe Montana was already gone, traded to Kansas City in 1993. Steve Young retired in 1999 after too many concussions. Jerry Rice, the greatest receiver ever, started showing his age. But the real killer was the front office chaos. Eddie DeBartolo Jr., the owner who had built the Dynasty, was forced to give up control of the team due to legal troubles. His sister Denise York took over, and everything changed. The culture that had made the 49ers special, the attention to detail, the commitment to excellence, the family atmosphere started to erode. Coaches left. Front office executives departed. The institutional knowledge that had sustained the Dynasty walked out the door. By 2000, the 49ers were 6-10. The team that had been in the NFC Championship game just 2 years earlier was suddenly one of the worst in the league. The 49ers' collapse shows us that dynasties need more than just talent. They need stability, culture, and continuity. When all three disappear at once, even the greatest franchises can fall. The Dallas Cowboys of the early 1990s were unstoppable. 3 Super Bowls in 4 years. Troy Aikman, Emmitt Smith, Michael Irvin, the triplets. They had talent, swagger, and a coach in Jimmy Johnson who knew how to win. But their collapse wasn't about aging players or salary cap issues, it was about ego and stupidity. Jerry Jones and Jimmy Johnson built that dynasty together. Jones provided the resources, Johnson provided the football genius. They were perfect partners until they weren't. The problem was that both men wanted credit for the success. Jones wanted to be seen as a football mastermind, not just a rich guy who wrote checks. Johnson wanted recognition as the architect of the dynasty. The tension exploded after their second Super Bowl win in 1994. After the victory party, both men were drunk and started arguing about who deserved credit. Johnson said he could coach anywhere and win. Jones said he could win with any coach. 2 months later, Johnson was gone. Jones replaced him with Barry Switzer, a college coach who was completely unprepared for the NFL. The Cowboys still had talent. They won another Super Bowl in 1995 with Switzer, but the culture was rotting from within. Players were partying too much, getting arrested, losing focus. The discipline that Johnson had instilled was gone. Then came the salary cap. The Cowboys had been spending like drunken sailors, assuming they could always afford to keep their stars. Suddenly, they couldn't. Key players left for more money elsewhere. By 1996, the Cowboys were 6-10. The team that had dominated the early 90s was suddenly irrelevant. They haven't won a Super Bowl since 1995, nearly 30 decades ago. The Cowboys' collapse is the most frustrating because it was completely avoidable. They had everything: talent, resources, momentum, and threw it away because of ego and poor management. For 20 years, the New England Patriots were the NFL's evil empire. 6 Super Bowl wins, 9 Super Bowl appearances, 17 division titles. Tom Brady and Bill Belichick turned a mediocre franchise into the most successful dynasty in NFL history. But even the greatest dynasties end, and the Patriots' collapse was both sudden and inevitable. The first crack appeared in 2019. The Patriots went 12-4 and won the division, but they looked different. Brady was 42 and showing his age. The offense was struggling. The magic that had sustained them for 2 decades was fading. Then came the 2020 season and everything fell apart at once. Brady, the greatest quarterback in NFL history, decided he'd had enough. He wanted to play in a warm weather city with better conditions. He wanted to prove he could win without Belichick. So, he left for Tampa Bay. The Patriots were left with Cam Newton, a former MVP who was a shell of his former self. Newton couldn't throw accurately, couldn't stay healthy, and couldn't run the complex system that Brady had mastered. But losing Brady was just the beginning. The Patriots had been mortgaging their future for years, trading away draft picks to make win-now moves. Their roster was old, expensive, and thin at key positions. The salary cap finally caught up with them. They had to release or trade veteran players they couldn't afford. The depth that had sustained them through injuries was gone. In 2020, the Patriots went 7-9 and missed the playoffs for the first time since 2008. The dynasty was over. The Patriots' collapse teaches us that even the greatest partnerships eventually end. Brady and Belichick were perfect together, but when one decided to leave, the whole thing crumbled. The Denver Broncos dynasty was brief but brilliant. Back-to-back Super Bowl wins in 1997 and 1998 led by John Elway and Terrell Davis. They had finally gotten over the hump after years of heartbreak. But their collapse was swift and brutal, and it all centered around two devastating losses. First, John Elway retired after the 1998 season. He was 38, had finally won his Super Bowls, and decided to go out on top. Smart decision for him, disaster for the Broncos. Elway wasn't just their quarterback, he was their identity. For 16 years, he had been the face of the franchise, the guy who made impossible comebacks, the leader who willed them to victory. When he left, the Broncos lost their soul. But they still had Terrell Davis, the running back who had rushed for over 2,000 yards and won Super Bowl MVP. If Davis could stay healthy, maybe they could survive without Elway. He couldn't. Davis suffered a devastating injury in the 1999 preseason that effectively ended his career. The guy who had been the best running back in football was suddenly done at age 26. The Broncos went from back-to-back champions to 6-10 in one season. They had no quarterback, no running game, and no identity. The collapse was complete. The Broncos' fall shows us how fragile dynasties can be. Lose two key players, and a championship team can become a laughingstock overnight. The Indianapolis Colts weren't a traditional dynasty. They only won one Super Bowl, but they were the model of sustained excellence. From 1999 to 2010, they made the playoffs 11 times, won 10 or more games 12 times, and were always a threat to win it all. The reason was simple. Peyton Manning, the greatest regular season quarterback in NFL history, turned the Colts into an annual contender. As long as Manning was healthy, the Colts were dangerous. Then came 2011, and everything changed. Manning had been dealing with neck problems for years, but he'd always played through them. In 2011, the injuries finally caught up with him. He needed multiple surgeries, missed the entire season, and suddenly looked mortal. The Colts, who had built their entire identity around Manning, were lost without him. They started Curtis Painter and Dan Orlovsky at quarterback. They went 2-14, the worst record in franchise history. But here's the crazy part. That terrible season saved their future. The Colts got the #1 pick and drafted Andrew Luck, Manning's replacement. It should have been a seamless transition from one franchise quarterback to another. Instead, the Colts made one of the most shocking decisions in NFL history. They released Manning, the greatest player in franchise history, because they didn't want to pay his $28 million bonus. Manning signed with Denver and immediately returned to elite form. The Colts got their new quarterback in Luck, but they lost their identity and their connection to their greatest era. The Colts' collapse wasn't about aging or salary cap issues. It was about one injury that changed everything. Sometimes, dynasties end not with a whimper, but with a devastating blow. The Seattle Seahawks dynasty was built on defense and attitude. The Legion of Boom, Richard Sherman, Earl Thomas, Cam Chancellor, and the rest, was the most dominant secondary in modern NFL history. They were loud, cocky, and nearly unstoppable. From 2012 to 2015, they made the playoffs 4 straight times, reached 2 Super Bowls, and won 1. They should have won both, but we'll get to that. The beginning of the end came on February 1st, 2015. Super Bowl 49, Seahawks vs. Patriots. Seattle was on the Patriots' 1-yard line with 26 seconds left, down by 4. They had Marshawn Lynch, one of the best short yardage runners in the league. Everyone expected them to hand the ball to beast mode and punch it in for the win. Instead, they threw a slant pass that Malcolm Butler intercepted. Game over. Dynasty over. That interception broke something in the Seahawks. The confidence, the swagger, the belief that they were destined for greatness, it all evaporated in one play. But the real collapse came later. The Legion of Boom started breaking up. Richard Sherman tore his Achilles. Earl Thomas broke his leg. Cam Chancellor had neck problems. The defense that had carried them to greatness was falling apart. The Seahawks also had salary cap issues. They couldn't afford to keep all their stars. Sherman was traded to San Francisco. Thomas was traded to Baltimore. The band was breaking up. By 2018, the Seahawks were rebuilding. The team that had been a Super Bowl contender for 4 straight years was suddenly starting over. The Seahawks collapse shows us that sometimes one play can change everything. That interception didn't just cost them a Super Bowl, it ended their dynasty. Now, let's talk about a dynasty that might be collapsing in real time: the Kansas City Chiefs. Wait, hear me out. The Chiefs just won back-to-back Super Bowls. They have Patrick Mahomes, the best quarterback in the league. They're the defending champions. How can they be collapsing? Because dynasties don't collapse overnight. They erode slowly, and the warning signs are already there. First, the salary cap. The Chiefs are in cap hell. They've had to release or trade key players like Tyreek Hill, Orlando Brown Jr., and others because they couldn't afford to keep them. The depth that helped them win championships is disappearing. Second, the division is getting better. The Chargers have Justin Herbert. The Broncos have a solid defense. The Raiders are always dangerous. The AFC West isn't the cakewalk it used to be. Third, Mahomes is carrying more of the load than ever. When you have to rely on one player to make magic happen every week, eventually, that player gets worn down or injured. The Chiefs are still great, but they're not as dominant as they were 2 years ago. The margin for error is shrinking. The window is closing. Now, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe Mahomes is so good that he can sustain this dynasty for another decade. Maybe the Chiefs will figure out how to navigate the salary cap and keep winning. But history tells us that every dynasty ends. The question isn't if the Chiefs will collapse, it's when and how. Every dynasty thinks they're different. Every dynasty thinks they've figured out how to beat Father Time, outsmart the salary cap, and maintain excellence forever. But they're all wrong. The Packers thought Lombardi's system would outlast Lombardi himself. The Steelers thought the steel curtain would never rust. The 49ers thought they could buy their way to eternal success. The Cowboys thought talent alone was enough. The Patriots thought Brady and Belichick would play forever. They were all wrong. And that's what makes these collapses so fascinating and so inevitable. Some dynasties die from natural causes: aging, injuries, retirements. Others commit suicide through ego, poor decisions, and front office stupidity. But they all die eventually. The NFL is designed for parity. The salary cap, the draft system, free agency. It's all built to prevent teams from staying on top too long. The league wants every fan base to have hope, which means no team can dominate forever. But here's the thing about dynasty collapses. They're not just endings. They're beginnings. The Patriots' collapse opened the door for new contenders. The Cowboys' fall let other teams rise. Every dynasty that ends creates space for the next one to begin. And that's the beauty of the NFL. No matter how dominant a team looks, no matter how unstoppable they seem, you know that somewhere, somehow, their time will come. The only question is whether it'll be a gradual decline or a spectacular crash. The dynasties we covered today all learned the same hard lesson. In the NFL, nobody stays on top forever. The mountain is steep, the air is thin, and eventually, everyone falls. But for a brief shining moment, these teams were perfect. They were champions. They were dynasties. And even though they all collapsed, even though they all fell from grace, they gave us memories that will last forever. That's the trade-off of greatness in the NFL. Burn bright, burn fast, and leave a legacy that people will talk about long after you're gone. If you enjoyed this breakdown of NFL dynasty collapses, I'm going to be posting a lot more content like this, so it would mean a lot if you subscribed and dropped a like for the algorithm. Thanks for watching.